Ah, you're here again. Another sleepless night. Another quiet hour when the world outside fades into stillness, and the mind, oh, the mind, begins to crave the kind of truths you never dare say aloud in daylight. You didn't come here for polished statues or marble columns tonight, did you? No, no. You're here for what they don't teach in school. You're here for the stench beneath the glory. For the empire whose name we still whisper with reverence. Rome, but whose hygiene habits could make a sewer rat dry heave. And I promise you, what you're about to hear won't just make your skin crawl. It'll make you question how civilizations rise so high on legs so unwashed. You see, history has a way of scrubbing itself clean. It shines its artifacts, polishes its busts, dusts off its scrolls, and lights them just right. All for the comfort of modern minds that can quite stomach the stench of what came before. But Rome, my dear insomniac, Rome was not a clean story. It was a city of blood, of grandeur, of gods, and of shared sponges soaked in feces, of piss-filled jars passed from hand to hand, of banquet halls where vomit was just a polite intermission. Rome was magnificent, but Rome, in the most intimate corners, was absolutely revolting. And tonight, we slip into those corners. Quietly, shamefully, like voyeurs of rot. Close your eyes if you must, or keep them open, wide and dry and unblinking, because the truth comes best when it startles. Let me take you back. Not to the Senate floor, not to the triumphs or the temples, but to the latrine. Yes, the latrine. Stone benches with holes carved like indifferent mouths, lined side by side like old friends who'd given up on privacy. No partitions, no shame. And between each pair of thighs, a stick, a sponge, wet, used, soaked again, reused, passed along like a baton in the foulest relay race you never wanted to win. Romans called it the tersorium, a gentle word for a brutal act. After relieving themselves, they would reach for this communal tool of cleanliness, a sea sponge, fastened to a wooden handle, dipped in salt water or vinegar or simply whatever was at hand, and they would wipe, one after another, over and over again. No disinfection, no replacement, just faith that the gods or the vinegar or the sheer power of denial would protect them. You're squirming already. I don't blame you. But here's the catch. They didn't see it as disgusting. Not in the way you or I might. To a Roman, privacy was weakness. Modesty was childish. They relieved themselves side by side, discussed politics over bowel movements, and considered excrement as part of the divine cycle of digestion, a sacred system granted by Jupiter himself. They bathed obsessively, yes. But bathing was not about hygiene. It was about status, social connection, gossip, business deals. Scraping oil from your skin with a strigil was elegant. Wiping your anus with a used sponge was expected. You begin to see it, don't you? The contradiction, the madness. A city that engineered aqueducts to bring mountain water across continents, but didn't mind sharing a shit-soaked sponge with 50 strangers. An empire that built the Pantheon, that measured the stars, that forged a language still etched into the bones of law and medicine, and yet, at its core, couldn't be bothered to separate toilet from temple, piss from perfume, because everything to them was part of the same breath of life, the same body. You want beauty? Rome will give you beauty, but you must accept her breath. And it wasn't just the sponge. There was urine too, and not just in latrines. No, urine was currency, a resource. They collected it, in public jars, labeled like rainwater or oil. Men would urinate into amphorae, placed on the sides of buildings, not out of convenience, but for tax purposes. Yes, the urine tax, introduced by Emperor Vespasian, taxed the collection of urine, which was sold to foolers who used it for laundry. Why? Because the ammonia in urine bleached togas, whiter than white. So next time you see a senator's glowing robes, remember, it wasn't sunlight that cleaned it. It was piss. You feel the nausea creeping up now? That's good. That's honest. That's what history should do when it tells the truth. And the mouths. Oh, let's not forget the mouths. Roman women, the ones you see in statues with their heads tilted in quiet serenity, often rinsed their teeth with urine. Imported, if they could afford it. Spanish urine was prized for its strength. Stronger, perhaps, because of the diet or the wine. Either way, it was believed to whiten teeth and strengthen gums. And so, in the back rooms of villas, among vials and beauty tools, there it sat, the golden bottle. The gift of strangers, bottled and blessed. Still with me? Good, because we haven't even entered the public baths yet. And the baths, my dear sleepless wanderer, are where shame drowned and disease swam. But not yet. Not yet. You see, it's not enough to know what they did. That's just trivia. Pub quizzes and cocktail parties. You're here because you want to feel it. You want to smell the history. You want to stare it in the eyes when no one else dares to look. You want to understand how a people so brilliant, so disciplined, so artistic, could also be so obliviously, majestically filthy, and how that filth wasn't a flaw in the machine. It was the machine. It was part of the engine that ran the empire. Because filth in Rome wasn't private, it was public. It was ritual, it was performance. A senator could orate to a crowd of thousands and then squat beside a slave in the latrine moments later. A noblewoman could smear feces-based face masks and call it beauty. A gladiator could bleed on the sands and later have his sweat bottled and sold to eager women as aphrodisiac perfume. The boundaries between clean and unclean, sacred and profane, body and city, were blurred in Rome, deliberately. Blurred until no one noticed the line had ever existed. So tonight, we peel that illusion back, gently, with the patience of rot. We go deeper, beyond the sponge, beyond the jars, into the fevered flesh of a civilization whose marble facade concealed infections of both mind and matter, not to mock, not to judge, but to witness. Because if Rome could rise while bathing in its own sewage, if it could last 1,000 years while its people kissed each other's cheeks with mouths rinsed in piss ... then perhaps we must ask ourselves what we are standing on, what rituals we call normal, what absurdities we've rebranded as logic, and whether, in the mirror of their filth, we might just see the stain of our own reflections. You want more? Good, because the sponge was just the beginning. They were never quiet, those latrines. Not even at night. Not even when the moon glared down through a hole in the ceiling like an offended god. You'd think it would be silence, wouldn't you? The kind of place people hurry through, heads down, eyes averted. But no. In Rome, even the act of defecation had a soundtrack. Laughter, debate, groans of digestion and philosophy merging into one long murmur of flesh and thought. A place where bodies opened and mouths didn't stop moving. Rome didn't believe in secrets, not the bodily kind. Not the kind that stank. They built these places proudly, with their cold stone benches arranged in semicircles like miniature amphitheaters for the anus. Their holes carved without lids or locks, or even shame. And the holes weren't private. No, they were friends with one another. Close, shoulder to shoulder, thigh to thigh. Sometimes your leg would brush a stranger's as you strained. Sometimes you'd hear the splash before you felt the relief. And sometimes, oftentimes, you'd pass the tersorium to a neighbor without looking him in the eye. Because to look would be to acknowledge, and acknowledgement makes filth real. But Rome had long since learned how to make the real unreal. They built marble walls around the grotesque and called it normal. They enshrined it in routine. In the early morning, slaves would line up to scrub the seats. Not for sanitation, that concept was still centuries unborn, but for presentation. The illusion of cleanliness was far more useful than the effort itself. If it looked clean, it must be blessed. If the gods hadn't struck them down yet, then clearly the system worked. Superstition made a better filter than science. And so, the latrine was a place of communion, not withdrawal. A site of politics and bowel movement, of laughter and fart, of economy and diarrhea stitched together into one seamless civic experience. You're still here. Good. Because now we descend. Imagine this. A senator, perhaps, robes wrapped around his waist, adjusting the folds so they don't dip into the grime beneath the seat. On his left, a freedman, once a slave, now rich in oil trade. On his right, a soldier on leave, thighs thick and scarred from years of conquest. None of them look at each other directly, but they talk. They compare figs. They argue about taxes. They whisper about a neighbor's affair. All while the body performs its truth. The release, the hiss, the wet slap against water far below. The sponge, soaking in vinegar, waits patiently in a shallow gutter carved before their feet. When one man finishes, he leans forward, retrieves the stick, and wipes, slowly, deliberately. He then plunges it back into the gutter, letting the sponge soak again in the same stew of vinegar and feces and time. Then he passes it. Always passes it. That's how it worked, and no one flinched. Not then, because shame in Rome wasn't in what your body did. It was in not knowing your place, in not playing your part. To defecate was not shameful, but to forget your rank while doing it? That was unforgivable. A slave could relieve himself beside a patrician, yes, but he mustn't speak first. He mustn't look up. Hierarchy didn't disappear in the stink. It was only made more grotesque, elevated, made sacred by its juxtaposition with filth. There was something almost religious about it, as if the gods themselves sat invisibly among them, laughing quietly at how mortals tried to make meaning from manure. And still, the city hummed. Because Rome was a city that breathed through its orifices, not just its lungs. It pulsed with human waste, carried away through cloaca, those vast underground channels designed not merely to remove excrement, but to hide it, to drown it in darkness, so that above ground, the illusion of cleanliness could hold. The Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer of Rome, was more than infrastructure. It was a theological concept. Proof that civilization could master even its most primal needs. That man could shit and still call himself divine. But what does it mean, truly mean, to share your most private act with the public world? It means you stop seeing your body as your own. Your digestion becomes civic. Your odor becomes atmospheric. Your rectum is no longer a matter of self, but of state. And that is the most Roman thing of all. The surrender of the private to the spectacle of the republic, or the empire, depending on the century. You belong to the city, and so did your shit. And you learn not just to accept this, but to revel in it. To speak freely while your gut's emptied. To debate the nature of justice while your neighbor strained beside you. To wipe with a sponge you did not own, did not clean, and did not question. Modern minds gag at this. We search for disgust in the wrong places. We assume history should be an upward climb. Dirt to soap, cave to penthouse, outhouse to bidet. But Rome reminds us that the curve isn't always smooth. That greatness and grotesquerie dance together, close enough to kiss. That an empire can raise aqueducts and still stink. That dignity, in some ages, means sharing a bench while you defecate in front of your neighbor's sandal. I wonder, truly, whether this intimacy bred a kind of honesty that we've since lost. After all, when you've shit beside a man, can he really lie to your face? When you've passed the sponge that still holds the memory of your bile, your dinner, your disease, does it not make deceit harder to swallow? Perhaps shame is a modern invention. Or perhaps we've simply traded one kind of shame for another. We no longer shit in public, but we perform our lives in public endlessly, shamelessly, through screens and symbols and curated decay. The sponge is gone, yes, but the performance? That has only grown. And don't for a moment believe this system was confined to the poor. Wealth didn't buy you privacy. It bought you marble seats and slaves to warm them. It bought you rose water to mask the scent. But the act, the squat, the wipe, the pass, remained universal. Even the emperor relieved himself. Even he wiped with a sponge not his own. Even he, in the final analysis, was flesh. Rome loved to remind its people of this. Memento mori, they said, remember, you will die. And before you die, you will shit, like the beggar, like the soldier, like the whore. You will pass the sponge. So what happened in those latrines wasn't just physical. It was spiritual, psychological. It bound people together in the most intimate, revolting ritual of civic life. They walked in clothed in dignity and walked out marked by the same filth, the same scent, the same saltwater streaked sponge. And perhaps that was the point. In a city of excess and spectacle, it was the latrine that leveled the playing field. That reminded everyone, senator and slave alike, of their gut, their stink, their need. In Rome, the gods dined high on Olympus, but the people met one another in the sewer. And yet, despite all this, the city thrived. It grew. It conquered. It ruled the known world from a marble seat built above a river of excrement. It codified laws, minted coins, built colosseums. And all the while, its citizens sat side by side, whispered their conspiracies, passed the sponge. The filth didn't weaken them. It defined them. It connected them. It made them rumhung. And perhaps that's the most uncomfortable truth of all. Because it's easy to dismiss such habits as barbaric, as backward. But Rome was neither. Rome was ahead. In engineering, in politics, in war, in art, and still the sponge. Still the piss jars. Still the open latrines. It wasn't ignorance. It was ideology. It was philosophy through feces. They weren't trying to be clean. They were trying to be Romo. And now, thousands of years later, we build walls. We spray. We flush. We sanitize. We pretend. We create the illusion that our bodies are not factories of rot, that our bowels are not ancient engines of embarrassment. We hide behind doors. We fear the sound, the smell, the act. We've replaced the sponge with paper and the communal with the solitary. We've traded familiarity for fragility. But maybe ... just maybe. We've lost something in the process. Something brutal. Something monding. Something horrifyingly human. And if the latrines were Rome's underbelly, raw, honest, unscented, then the baths were her mirror, foggy, glossed, laced with rose oil and illusion. You see, the baths pretended to be what the latrines never tried to fake. Clean, civilized, elevated. They were temples of hygiene, where bodies came not to be purified, but to be seen purifying, a ritual soaked not in sanitation, but in spectacle. If the sponge reminded every Ramon that they were just another animal with a hole to wipe, then the Thermi whispered to them that they could be gods. If only for an hour slicked in oil, swallowed in steam, surrounded by bodies glistening and grunting in practiced vanity. But don't let the scent of lavender fool you. The baths were filth wrapped in fragrance. No one scrubbed before they entered. They scraped. With metal. A curved blade called a strigil, dragged across the skin not to cleanse, but to remove. Oil, sweat, street grime, the breath of 1,000 hands that had touched 1,000 amphorae. All of it massaged deep into the pores before being scraped out like secrets from a diary. And where did it go? Into the gutter, into the pool, into the warm, inviting water where another bather would soon step, sigh, submerge. Yes, they sat in each other's runoff. They soaked in it. They luxuriated in it. Not out of ignorance. No, they were far too clever for that. But because the illusion of removal, mattered more than the act itself. There was order to the filth. Ritual, structure. The warm room, the hot room, the cold plunge. The progression was choreographed like a religious rite, and in many ways, it was. Roman bathing wasn't a task, it was a declaration. That one belonged. That one had the time to idle, the oil to waste, the slaves to attend. Cleanliness was not about health, it was about hierarchy, and the dirt never quite left. It only moved, from the skin to the blade, from the blade to the floor to the steam, from the steam to the lungs. They breathed each other in like incense, and called it culture. The bodies were everywhere. Fat, thin, oiled, scarred, erect, shriveled, all on display. And no one flinched. There were no private stalls, no fogged glass, no need. In Rome, to be naked was not to be exposed, it was to be aligned with nature, with power, with the divine, because only those ashamed of their station covered themselves. The free man bared it all, his belly, his penis, his past. Shame was for slaves. And even they, when allowed into the baths, stripped without hesitation. Because here, even the body belonged to the empire. And the empire had seen worse. Imagine it now. The caldarium, thick with heat, where old men debated the Senate's latest folly while oil dripped from their nipples like melting wax. Young boys dashed between pools, carrying towels and towels soaked in more than just water. The air reeked of ambition, of arousal, of decay carefully perfumed into submission. Somewhere, a poet recited Virgil. Somewhere else, a man vomited into a corner. The floor was slick with olive oil and stories. And the sound of the strigil, metal on skin, metal on memory, rang like the distant echo of a civilization shaving away its sins. They believed it made them better, cleaner, holier, even. The Greeks had taught them that cleanliness was next to godliness, and the Romans, ever the obsessive students, took that lesson and licked it clean. But they misunderstood, or perhaps they chose to misunderstand, because for Rome, cleanliness was not absence of dirt. It was conquest of it. The body didn't need to be sterile. It needed to be presented as conquered. The more grime one removed, the more civilized one became. And so, they oiled themselves to attract the dirt, to collect it like tribute, and then scraped it off like spoils of war. It wasn't about being clean. It was about being seen trying. And oh, how they were seen. The baths were not quiet places. They buzzed. With gossip, with moans, with music. Musicians were paid to play while men bathed. Prostitutes prowled the perimeter, sometimes allowed, sometimes banned, but always desired. Deals were made there. Favors whispered. Eyes met and lingered. Hands brushed against thighs too long to be accidental. The water, warm and thick, carried secrets better than any courier. A senator might find himself shoulder to shoulder with a gladiator. A philosopher might sit beside a pickpocket. The steam equalized, for a moment, and yet never truly did, because beneath it all, Rome remembered its lines. Always. There were rules, social ones, unspoken and ironclad. Who entered first? Who got the warmest water? Who scraped whose back? The sponge had taught them hierarchy and filth. The bath taught them performance and cleanliness. Both were mirrors, cracked and fogged, showing the same face from opposite angles. The baths were cleaner, yes, but only in the way a lie is cleaner than the truth. More fragrant, easier to believe. And yet, and this is where it twists, the baths were beloved, deeply, desperately. The people needed them, not just for the body, but for the soul. Because Rome, for all its power, was a machine that chewed through humanity with relentless efficiency. And the baths were pause. They were softness. A rare moment when the citizen could exhale, when the slave could taste warmth without command. They were temples of the flesh. And every day, thousands visited, paying their quadrans, the smallest Roman coin, not for soap, but for belonging. But what of the water? Ah, the water. You'd think, with all their aqueducts and fountains, that it would be pure, sacred even. But Rome, like always, was contradiction dressed in genius. The water came from rivers, from springs, yes, but it flowed through pipes of lead, heavy, poisonous, efficient. They lined their empire with veins of death and called it progress. The baths, in all their glory, were slowly killing their people. Lead seeped into their skin, into their blood, into their minds. Madness, infertility, disease, all draped in the fragrance of rose oil and civility. They did not know. Or maybe they did. And they chose beauty anyway. And then there was the natatio, the open-air pool. Cold, vast, reflecting the sky like a second heaven. There, Romans floated, weightless for a moment, unchained from the grind of empire. Children splashed, lovers whispered. Old men bobbed like buoys of memory. And below them, always, the water held everything. Oil, sweat, piss, blood, bits of scraped skin. A soup of humanity simmering beneath the illusion of serenity. No one spoke of it. No one needed to. That was the Roman contract. We do not speak of the rot, so long as the marble shines. And the slaves. Always the slaves. They were the invisible hands of this whole charade. Heating the water, cleaning the floors, massaging the oil, scraping the skin. Some were born into it. Some captured. Some bought. All forgotten. Their hands held more Roman skin than any lover. They inhaled more Roman sweat than any citizen. And they bathed only when allowed. Often after the crowd had left. In the same water. Always the same water. There's something devastating about it. That even in the pursuit of purity, someone had to carry the dirt. That every Roman step toward godliness left a smear behind. For someone else to clean, to inhale, to drown in. And still, the baths thrived. They expanded. They grew ornate. Some could hold thousands at once. They added libraries, gardens, gymnasiums. Because why not? If the body is temple, then let it read. Let it lift. Let it seduce. Let it decay. And decay they did. Not all at once. Slowly. Like mold beneath tile. The empire aged. The marble cracked. The lead did its work. And still they bathed. Still they scraped. Still they poured more oil. They could not stop. It had become identity. To be Roman was to oil, to scrape, to soak, even as the world shifted, even as the barbarians gathered, even as the empire began to forget its own name. What survives now? Ruins, empty pools, strigils in museums, and myths, myths of cleanliness, of superiority. But if you lean close, really close, you can still smell it. The oil, the sweat, the desperation, the performance, the haunting aroma of a people who believed they could outbathe their own mortality. They couldn't, of course. No one can. And so the sponge was shared, the baths were crowded, and now we come to what seeped between them all. Not the things they touched or the places they entered, but what leaked, wept, dripped, sprayed, curdled, poured. Because to the Roman, the body wasn't just a vessel. It was a fountain, a temple leaking offerings to unseen deities. And each fluid had its purpose, its poetry, its price. They didn't hide their fluids. They bottled them, sold them, prayed with them, bathed in them, rubbed them in with fingers chapped from centuries of inherited belief. And in this strange, sticky religion of flesh, purity was not the absence of filth, but the mastery of it. Blood wasn't disgusting, it was divine. Spit wasn't shame, it was spellwork. Milk wasn't nourishment, it was politics. And the sweat of a dying man could sell for more than a philosopher's scroll. You think I exaggerate. You think this is theatrical. But the truth of it is far worse than any stagecraft could allow. We'll start with spit, because that's where the tongue begins. Rome never spat without intention. In the streets, yes. In the forums, constantly. But spit wasn't just expectorant, it was magic. Protection. Blessing. Roman mothers would spit thrice over their babies to ward off evil. A soldier might spit into his hands before gripping his sword. Lovers spat in each other's palms before swearing oaths. The act wasn't vile. It was vital. It carried essence, the soul suspended in saliva. A gladiator's spit before battle was watched like a priest's augury. If it landed sharp and wet, it meant victory. If it dribbled, sick and foamy, someone would die. So they believed, so they watched, and it didn't stop at omens. Spit was medicine. Sore eyes? Rub them with morning saliva. Toothache? Spit into a frog's mouth and release it into the woods. A cut? Dab it with spit and whisper Jupiter's name. They believed the body could heal itself, but only if you honored what flowed from it. Doctors, yes, the so-called physicians of the day collected saliva samples, not for science, but for superstition. The thick, yellow spit of a fevered man was a prophecy. The dry mouth of a girl in grief was diagnosis. They tasted the pain like wine tasters in a cellar of suffering. But if spit was soul, then milk was power. Not all milk. Not cows. Not goats. Human milk. Female milk. Ramung milk. The lactating breast was a symbol of the state of empire itself. Think of Romulus and Remus, the twin founders of Rome, suckling not at a woman's breast, but at the teats of a she-wolf. It wasn't bestiality, it was mythology. A metaphor so deeply erotic and political that they carved it into stone and never questioned the instinct. The empire suckled on wildness, on danger, on the raw flow of nature unbridled. Milk was not nourishment, it was loyalty. Wet nurses women employed to feed the children of the elite weren't just caretakers. They were instruments of dynasty. Their milk shaped the bloodlines of emperors. The aristocracy believed that a woman's temperament infused her milk. Too emotional? Your milk breeds cowards. Too angry? Your milk makes tyrants. So they chose their wet nurses with more scrutiny than their wives. They watched their diets, controlled their sleep, because every drop from their breasts was a drop into the veins of the future. Rome's sons were made of milk and myth, both curated with obsessive precision. And yet the mothers, the true mothers, were often absent. Out of duty, out of status. Because birthing was biological, but feeding was political. And in Rome, everything was performance. Even love, especially love, now blood. Now we reach the altar. Because nothing in Rome was more sacred, more feared, more manipulated than blood. It was currency. It was curse. It was spectacle. Gladiators bled in arenas, not merely to die, but to anoint the crowd with their valor. Women collected the blood of fallen warriors, dabbing cloths into the soil beneath the sand, soaking up courage like perfume. Some drank it, some applied it to their faces, believing it healed, believing it blessed, believing it transferred something that had only minutes before screamed its last breath into the roar of the Colosseum. Imagine that, applying the blood of a stranger to your cheeks and walking home more whole. But even more valuable than a gladiator's blood was a virgin's. Not because of virtue, but because of symbolism. The untouched body was believed to hold power unspoiled. And so, in certain rituals, virgins were cut not fatally, just enough to spill a few drops into the earth, or into wine, or onto a soldier's sword before battle. It was not violence. It was offering. The gods demanded it, or so the priests said, with eyes trained more on politics than on piety. And menstruation? You'd expect revulsion, rejection. But Rome was a land of contradictions. While some poets wrote of it with horror, others described menstrual blood as potent, even protective. A woman's cycle could ward off storms, spoil crops, curse enemies, or bless them, depending on who was watching. The blood of the womb was not hidden. It was whispered about, worshipped, weaponized, and then there was sweat. No, not the sweat of labor that was common, but the sweat of the exceptional, the sacred, the erotic. Gladiator sweat was bottled, sold in vials. Women paid high prices for it, not as perfume, but as aphrodisiac. They dabbed it onto their necks, their thighs, their nipples, to channel the strength of the man who had survived the arena, to steal his virility, to wear his pain like silk. Imagine the absurdity, the intimacy, the sheer madness of a world where the stench of terror became the scent of seduction. But Rome wasn't mad, not in the way you think. It was obsessed, with power, with control, with the myth of control over decay, and so it cataloged every fluid, named it, priced it, assigned it a virtue or a vice. Even urine, yes. Piss was sacred, not just for laundry, not just for whitening togas, but for taxes, for commerce, for jokes that every Roman child knew by heart. When Emperor Vespasian instituted the urine tax, his son protested. And yet, Vespasian said, holding a coin to his nose, it smells no different. The empire was built not just on stone, but on sarcasm soaked in excrement. They laughed at their filth. They owned it, elevated it, transformed it into religion, into ritual, into identity. And yet beneath it all, something throbbed, something rotten. Because when you exalt the body to the level of empire, you also inherit its collapse, its erosion, its pus-filled truths. Rome bled, Rome leaked, Rome oozed, and they called it progress. We today live behind glass, sterile, separated. We label our fluids medical waste, hide them in bins, flush them into oblivion. We pretend they don't define us. But Rome looked them in the eye, swallowed them, spat them with meaning, bled on purpose, milked the myth until it curdled into doctrine. And maybe, just maybe, in that grotesque intimacy, they understood something we've forgotten. That the body, in all its weeping, stinking honesty, tells a truth no ideology can cover. That a drop of blood says more than a flag. That a stream of milk shapes more futures than a Senate vote. That the body is not the opposite of the divine, but its mirror. Dirty, terrifying, sacred. And you, listening in the dark, how many of your secrets are wet? How many of your memories drip? You've seen the statues, haven't you? The cold marble mouths, the lips forever parted in silent nobility, the rows of teeth idealized in stone, frozen mid-oratory, as if Caesar himself had paused mid-word, waiting for the empire to lean in. But stone doesn't stink, and marble doesn't rot. And history, when carved by victors, tends to skip over the smell, the breath, the decay behind the rhetoric. But if you stood close enough to a Roman in life, close enough to hear his whisper, you would then smell it before you heard it. The empire didn't speak with clean breath. It spoke through 1,000 mouths dipped in ammonia. Because Romans didn't brush. They scrubbed, they polished, they whitened. Not for health, but for illusion. The mouth was a theater. And in Rome, the show never stopped. So they used what they had. And what they had was urine. Human urine. The more fermented, the better. Not fresh. No. Fresh urine was weak, cowardly. The best came in pots left out in the sun, collecting heat and time until it soured into something sharp enough to peel enamel from shame. They called it lant. A word soaked in practicality. This was no secret ritual, no back-alley oddity. It was public, open, bottled, sold, imported. Spanish urine, in particular, was prized for its potency. Something in the diet, they said, something in the wine. So the wealthy bought imported piss and rinsed their mouths with it each morning, standing tall before polished bronze mirrors, spitting elegance onto the floor. It was not vulgar. It was Roman, and the teeth, how they sparkled, white as marble. Or so they claimed. Because in a city where everything decayed, bodies, bricks, morals, the mouth had to lie. A clean smile could mask a rotting soul. A white grin could disguise political rot. And so the poor mimicked the rich, buying diluted lent in small vials, swishing like nobles, dreaming of senate seats and silk beds. Even slaves rinsed when they could, hoping a brighter smile might buy them mercy, or at least a gentler hand. But the irony, of course, was that piss corrodes. Over time, it eats the enamel, weakens the gums. What they gained in shine, it lost in strength. But Rome never cared for longevity. It cared for image, for spectacle. Better to gleam and fall than to dull and endure. The empire taught its people this lesson daily. In the forum, in the bath, in the mirror. And so the teeth of Rome told a story, not of health, but of ambition, desperation. The smile of a prostitute, polished in ammonia, could outshine that of a senator. And the senator knew it. He could taste the fear in his own mouth. Behind every conversation, behind every smirk, and every nod, was the unspoken agreement. We know what it takes to smile like this. We know the cost. And we pay it anyway. Children were taught young. Before they learned to write, they learned to spit. A mother would guide her daughter's hand, lifting the vial, watching as she gargled. For your future, she'd say. For your wedding. And the girl would wince, but swallow the lesson. Because Rome wasn't kind to ugliness. It forgave murder before it forgave yellow teeth. And breath? Oh, the breath. It was warfare. Politicians used it like weapons. The man who could speak longest without recoiling at his own stench was the man who won. Debate wasn't about truth. It was about endurance. About standing close, too close, letting your opponent inhale your will. The strong didn't step back. The strong reeked forward. That was Rome. That was rhetoric. There were other tricks too. Crushed bones, oyster shell, charcoal, mixed into pastes, rubbed into gums. Not because it worked, but because it looked like effort. And in a society built on appearance, effort was enough. Even bleeding gums could be spun as devotion. As long as the smile held. Some even stitched jewels into their teeth. Tiny rubies. Pearls. A flash of wealth between sentences. Not to chew better, but to impress harder. And when one cracked, it was a badge of excess. I bit into power, they'd say, and cracked a diamond. Pain was theatrical. Everything was. And yet, for all this obsession, the rot never stopped. The cemeteries of Rome, when unearthed, tell a different story. Skulls with cavities, jaws with abscess scars, teeth lured to stumps. The remnants of an empire that chose gleam over health. That chose ammonia over medicine. That chose theater over truth. But even the dead smiled. Their bones still curved at the edges of the maxilla, mouths forever open in some silent joke, as if laughing at us for thinking we're any better. As if reminding us that behind every modern toothbrush, every tube of minty paste, every fluoride rinse, there is still the same desire. To lie, to smile wide, to be adored before we are understood. And then there were the marketplaces. Rows of stalls with vendors shouting over each other, selling not just fish and figs, but piss, collected, labeled, graded, aged. Some vendors even lied, claiming their jars were too weak matured, like fine wine. Others offered virgin's rinse, though who could verify? Buyers sniffed, compared, bartered. The streets of Rome didn't just run with sewage, they traded in it. Gold was precious, yes, but piss was useful. And it wasn't just for teeth. Urine was currency across the body, mixed into hair treatments, skin creams. cleaning solutions, a kind of golden miracle. The poor used it, the rich refined it, the emperor taxed it, and still no one called it disgusting. Because in Rome, function trumped feeling, and the function of piss was clear. It cleaned, it shined, it made you remong. There's a strange kind of pride in that, a pride of a people who didn't flinch from themselves, who took their filth and made it policy, who knew they stank and stank with intention, who smiled even as their gums bled, because the smile was the law, the requirement, the ticket to survive the games of empire. And perhaps that's the most Roman thing of all, not the aqueducts, not the armies, but the grin, the piss-soaked, jewel-cracked, blood-lined grin of a civilization that looked into the mirror and chose illusion. Every morning, every market day, every speech on the Senate floor, the empire was built by mouths. And mouths, my dear insomniac, are where the lies go to shine. And maybe tonight, when you brush your teeth in the dim glow of your bathroom light, you'll pause, just for a moment, and think of a woman in Rome, centuries ago, rinsing with piss, hoping her lover wouldn't leave. Or a slave, polishing his teeth with powdered brick, trying to catch the eye of a merchant who might buy him, not out of pity, but because he looked more expensive. Or a boy, biting his lip to hide the pain, because his father said real men don't flinch when the salt hits the gums. Real men spit, rinse, smile, bleed. And what about you? When you smile, who taught you how? You think you know hunger. You think you've tasted longing. But Rome devoured differently. It didn't eat because it was starving. It ate because it could. Because consumption, in the empire's bloodstream, was proof of domination. What was food, after all, but another form of conquest? Another territory to violate, to ferment, to drown in fish sauce and serve on a silver platter? No, Romans didn't dine. They performed hunger. They choreographed appetite. They rehearsed gluttony until it became grace. The kitchen wasn't a place to feed the body. It was a theater of rot, where filth was given flavor and decay was called delicacy. Come closer. Smell it. The Roman kitchen wasn't sterile. It didn't gleam. There were no cutting boards, no sinks, no gloves, just knives and oil and open fire. Clay pots with the memory of 10 meals clinging to their cracked interiors. Blood pooled on the dirt floor. Fish guts dried into the corners of wooden tables. Rats not feared, but simply chased. Cats slinking between thighs, licking bones still warm from the kill. And in the center of it all, a cook, not a chef, known just a man or a slave, whose fingers knew more about entrails than about rest. He was the true oracle of Rome, for he could read the future in the livers of sacrificed birds, and still make soup from it. And that soup? It wasn't fresh. Nothing was. Because Romans didn't worship freshness. They feared it. Fresh meant untested. Fresh meant unbroken. Fresh meant raw, and Rome didn't trust the raw, it trusted what had suffered. What had aged. What had rotted, just enough to whisper of death without delivering it. They ate fermented everything. Meat aged until green. Fish ground into paste and left in the sun. Milk turned to curdled glory. Wine that reeked of vinegar and smoke. And above all, garum, the empire's sacred rot, the lifeblood of Roman cuisine. A sauce made from fermented fish guts, aged in open-air vats beneath the unflinching Mediterranean sun, until it became something between liquid and ghost. They poured it on everything. On fruit, on cheese, on desserts. The rich diluted it with honey. The poor drank it as broth. It was salt. It was identity. It was the taste of empire. And no one ever asked where the fish came from, or how long it had been dead, or what else floated in the vat. Because when food becomes myth, it no longer needs truth. Garum was sacred. It smelled like the end of the world, but they bottled it like perfume. They traded it like coin. Entire industries built on the back of a stench. And still, they ate. Even the water wasn't safe. Pipes of lead ran like veins through the villas of the powerful, carrying water that glittered and killed slowly. But it tasted clean, so they drank. Rome always chose the lie that glittered over the truth that begged. And so, their food glistened, even as it festered. Their tables groaned beneath delicacies that whispered, "I am older than your appetite." And it wasn't just the ingredients. It was the performance. The feast. The vomitorium, not, as some imagine, a place to vomit, but rather a hallway in which the theater of consumption spilled into the architecture itself. But make no mistake, vomiting was encouraged. Between courses, between shows, a feather to the throat, a discreet turn of the head, because the stomach had limits, and Rome did not. So they made room, they purged to indulge again. Hunger was not a problem. It was a virtue. Picture the scene. A noble reclining on a couch, his robes parted to reveal a belly full of borrowed luxury. He dips a date in honeyed fish sauce, chews slowly, his eyes on the next platter. A slave approaches, offering a dormouse skinned, stuffed with herbs, roasted whole. The noble smiles, teeth still slick with piss-polished pride. He swallows. He signals for wine thick, red, sweetened to the point of syrup. Another course comes. Flamingo tongue, ostrich egg, boar stuffed with songbirds. Nothing was too rich, nothing too foul. The rarer, the stranger, the more it was celebrated. It wasn't about pleasure, it was about power. And beneath the table, always beneath, slaves waited, holding buckets, cloths, sometimes just their hands, to catch the vomit, to wipe the chin, to carry away the evidence of excess. They weren't cooks. They weren't servants. They were priests of a grotesque liturgy, silent, invisible, breathing in the same air, but never the same dignity. You want to flinch? Good. That means you still taste your own shame. Because Rome didn't flinch. Rome ate with abandon. Rome loved the foul, as long as it could name it. The rich named every ingredient. They recited the lineage of their olive oil, the geography of their anchovies. But they never spoke of what it did to their bodies. The cramps, the diarrhea, the infections, they were common, constant, expected, but never named. You could speak of conquest, of Jupiter, of love, but not of the pus between your gums or the worms in your stool. That would break the illusion. And Rome was built on illusions thick enough to swallow disease without chewing. Even the poor followed suit. They mimicked excess with whatever they could find: boiled cabbage, spoiled bread, stolen garum. They built dreams out of bones. And sometimes they ate each other. Not often, but often enough for whispers to echo down the centuries. Famines came, and when they did, the rules changed. Flesh is flesh, whether beast or beggar. Rome rarely judged what he could not see. And hunger, when it arrives, does not ask permission. And what of the tongue? That pink tyrant, the emperor of the face. Romans trusted the tongue above all else. It judged, it seduced, it betrayed. The tongue tasted the empire and recited it in poetry. It flattered emperors. It condemned criminals. It licked honey from the thighs of lovers and fish sauce from the bones of slaves. It was both weapon and worshipper. And they trained it. Children were taught to savor, to describe flavor like philosophers. Bitterness was not bad, it was complex. Sourness was noble. Rot was ... cultured. To gag was to confess ignorance. Only barbarians gagged. Romans swallowed. And when tongues failed, they were punished. Caught, burned, silenced. Because in a city where flavor was faith, a disloyal tongue was blasphemy. Even death had a flavor. Funerals were followed by feasts, not modest ones. Huge spreads, paid for by the deceased's family as a final flex. "He is dead," they said, "but look how he fed you." And so they ate in grief, mouths full of lamb and garlic and the silence of the newly absent. And they left full, not of sorrow, but of spectacle. And you, watching from centuries away, want to ask, was it worth it? The gut pain? The rotting teeth? The slow poison? The rivers of garum and shame? But that's not the question Rome would ask you. Rome would ask, did you taste it? Did you know, even for a moment, what it was to consume the world without apology? To lick the edge of filth and call it finesse? To turn hunger into art? And if the answer is no, Rome would not pity you. It would feed you until you begged it to stop. And then it would feed you more. And when the eating was done, when the garum had dried on lips still, wet with lies, when the wine had turned to slurred poetry, and the feathers had coaxed the vomit from noble throats to make space for more, Rome did not sleep. Rome undressed. Rome staggered, moaned, collapsed into the arms of slaves and strangers, and gods carved from ivory. Rome made love like it made war loud, messy, layered in oil and contradiction. There was no sanctity in the Roman bedroom. There was no shame either. There was only heat, only ritual, only the slow unraveling of togas, of titles, of skin, until what remained was the empire's true face, soft, swollen, leaking. The cubicula of those private rooms were rarely clean, even when draped in silks and adorned with peacock feathers. They smelled of sweat, of candle smoke, of old perfume mixed with newer lust. Sheets were reused, unwashed, reeking of the last night's fantasies. The walls heard too much. They soaked in the sounds, the creaks, the gasps, the slap of flesh, the arguments, the sobs, the silence. Sex in Rome was in private. It was often loud, performed, listened to, sometimes even watched, especially when it wasn't supposed to be. And the bodies they didn't bathe before coupling. Why would they? The oil still clung from the baths earlier that day. The strigil had scraped away the surface filth, but the scent remained. Rome didn't want to erase the body before using it. It wanted the taste of it, the musk of it, the proof that it had lived, sweated, bled. Lovers kissed mouths that still remembered the garum, fingers that had dipped into sauces and scrolls alike. No one sanitized their desires. They chewed them raw. Love wasn't clean. It was ritual soaked in grease. And desire, in Rome, didn't wait for permission. It wasn't fenced in by purity or monogamy. Husbands brought their slaves to bed. Wives brought musicians. Senators passed lovers between one another like fine wine. Fidelity was for statues and funerals. The living craved flesh, and Rome gave it in surplus. Gender mattered less than availability, status more than anatomy. If your skin was soft and your eyes held just the right amount of compliance or defiance, you would be chosen. That was the only rule. Even the gods slept around. Jupiter transformed into swans and bulls just to seduce mortals. Venus, goddess of love, had more lovers than temples. Their stories were passed down not as scandal, but as scripture. The divine was not clean. The divine was carnal. And so the people followed. Perfume hid much. They rubbed myrrh beneath their arms, sprinkled rosewater on their thighs. But beneath it all the stink of reality lingered, of unwashed feet, of untrimmed hair, of genitals still carrying the memory of a dozen strangers. They did not shave. They did not scrub. They scented. They masked. They performed. That was Rome's trick, making rot smell like roses long enough to pass for beauty. And if you looked closely, you'd see it. The itch, the rash, the swelling. Disease moved between bodies faster than the rumors. Syphilis had not yet been named, but it was there, beneath the surface, playing its long game. Parasites swam in the gut, lice in the hair, crabs between legs, and still they came. To brothels, to temples of love. to beds shared by 6 and sheets shared by none. Prostitution was not shameful. It was infrastructure. Regulated, taxed, catalogued. Brothels lined the streets like bakeries, each with its own menu, its own graffiti, crude drawings of acts and prices and promises. And when a man had coin, he spent it not on food, but on the momentary illusion that he was not alone, that he was desired, that his body still had currency. But what of the women? What of their filth, their power? Roman women, those born into wealth, were rarely expected to be clean. They were expected to be painted, layered in cosmetics made of chalk, lead, ashes, rouge from crushed insects, eyeliner from soot, lip color from iron oxide mixed with animal fat. Beauty was artifice. It clung to them like armor. They sweated beneath it, slept in it, woke with it smudged across the pillow like a map of forgotten desires. They were beautiful in the way dead flowers are beautiful, fading, fragrant, full of memory. Their hair held oil, dust, sometimes lice. Styled into impossible structures, they'd spend hours with slaves curling and pinning, adding extensions, sometimes even attaching mouse fur to create volume. Imagine the heat, the itch, the ache, and still they smiled. Because beauty in Rome was pain, and pain was the currency of belonging. And when the noble woman lay with her lover, she didn't undress fully. That was for whores. She pulled aside, lifted layers, let just enough skin be seen to keep the illusion of class. Her sweat mixed with perfume, her moans trained, never too loud. But the sheets still stained, always, and they were not changed. And beneath her chamber, another woman worked. A prostitute, a dancer, a slave. She too lay down, but with no performance. Just transaction, just heat, and sometimes just silence, because not all sex was desired. Rome was built on the bodies of the unwilling. That truth, too, reeks beneath the perfume of its history. Men paid extra for virgins, paid more for the illusion of reluctance, paid most for what they were not supposed to have. And the law only flinched when the victim had status. Otherwise, it turned away. Because in Rome, desire was not about consent. It was about power. But power, as always, comes with rot. The bedding told the truth, the stains that wouldn't wash, the blood that dried into shapes like forgotten maps, the scent that no oil could cover, the echo of what had been taken or given or performed. The rooms changed hands, but the sheets never forgot. And what of love? Did it exist in Rome? Of course, but not like you wanted to. Love in Rome was practical, strategic, often purchased. Sometimes grown over time, like mold on bread, slow, soft, inevitable. But even in the filth, there were moments. A touch lingered too long. A look softened. A name whispered in the dark, not out of duty, but because it hurt not to say it. That, too, was Rome. Among the sweat and salt and shame, there were flickers of something tender, but they never called it love. They called it madness, weakness, poetry. And when dawn came, the room remained, the bed unchanged, the sheets refolded, the evidence rearranged, not removed. Rome didn't erase its dirt. It restaged it. Each day, the same bodies performed new roles, the same fluids, new meanings, the same decay, repackaged in desire. And you, still awake, might ask, where was the line? Between pleasure and filth? Between love and lust? Between ritual and rot? But Rome never asked. Rome blurred. That was the secret. That was the seduction. And when it was finally over, when the breath rattled for the last time, and the body stopped leaking and twitching, and pretending Rome did not clean it, not right away, death in this empire was not a moment. It was a process. A slow rot wrapped in incense. They didn't fear corpses. They didn't run from the stench. They lingered in it. They lived beside it. For a people who kissed vomit-streaked lips and swallowed sweat with sugar, what was a little death under the fingernails? The body was not sacred in death, because it had never been sacred in life. It was useful. It was clay. It was still warm. The first thing they did was not wash the body, but close the eyes. The soul, they believed, left through the pupils. If you didn't close them fast enough, it might wander, might get lost, might haunt. So they pressed fingers against eyelids still wet from tears or fever. And if no one was there to do it, if the dead had no kin, then the eyes stayed open, watching, accusing, their final protest against a city that had always preferred performance to presence. The mouth was next. They placed a coin under the tongue wall for Charon, the ferryman of the underworld. Not out of love, but habit. Even beggars received this last payment, because in Rome, even the dead paid taxes. The afterlife was bureaucratic, transactional, like everything else. They believed that without the coin, the soul would be trapped on the riverbank, mouth open, forever thirsty. And so they gave. Even if they gave nothing else, then came the watchers. The women, mostly, hired mourners. Wailing was a skill. Grief was staged. They tore their garments, scratched their faces, rubbed dirt into their hair. They screamed names they didn't know, sobbed for fathers they'd never seen alive. Their tears were real only in sound, but that was enough. The louder the grief, the more honored the dead. Rome did not do silence. It filled death with noise. The body stayed in the house for several days, unembalmed. The rich perfumed it, doused it in oils, lit incense, draped it in garlands. The poor did what they could, covered the face, cracked a window. But the rot came anyway, slowly, then all at once. The flies, the color, the slump of the jaw, the collapse of the belly. Death is not delicate, and Rome never pretended it was. And when it was time, when the family had wailed enough, and the neighbors had nodded enough, and the stink could no longer be softened, they carried the body out. Through the streets, feet first, always, to confuse the soul, so it couldn't find its way back. Superstition hung in the air like steam. If someone died in your house, you smeared the doorframe with red. If you touched the dead, you washed in running water. If a bird flew overhead during the procession, you turned your face, just in case. The funeral was not quiet. It was a parade. Musicians, mourners, actors wearing the wax masks of ancestors, walking with the posture and gestures of the dead. A theater of remembrance, a grotesque puppetry of bloodlines. They didn't grieve in solitude. They grieved in performance, because Rome never allowed emotion without audience. And all this just to place the body in the earth, or on the pyre, or into the wall, depending on wealth, depending on law, depending on mood. Some were buried, others burned. Some ashes were kept in urns as fine as any goblet. Others tossed into pits, mass graves for the nameless. And yet even the pits were blessed. A priest mumbled. A coin dropped. A name scratched into a stone no one would read. And the fire, it did not purify. It revealed, hair curled, skin blistered. The mouth opened once more, one last gasp into nothing. Bones cracked like kindling. And when it was over, the family gathered the ashes with bare hands, still warm, still clinging to splinters of identity. They didn't flinch, because flinching meant you believed it could happen to you. And Rome did not allow such softness. The grave was not just for the dead, it was for the living. Offerings were placed, food, wine, toys for children, tools for men, jewelry for women. Not because they believed it traveled with them, but because it looked good. The graves were curated. Death, like dinner, needed presentation. But then they left, and Rome moved on. The same streets, the same steps, a new feast perhaps, a new bed. The body gone but not removed. It lingered in the bedsheets, in the hallway, in the mouth that had once kissed it and now bit into lamb. The Romans did not clean death. They walked around it, until it faded. Except it didn't, because every Roman home had a lararium, a small shrine, in the corner, near the kitchen. A place to light candles for the ancestors, to offer a drop of wine, a piece of fruit, a whispered apology. The dead were still there, watching, listening. The same unclean hands that kneaded dough also touched the tiny statues of the long dead. Filth and faith side by side. And every year they celebrated the Parentalia, a festival for the dead, not to mourn, to remember. They visited graves, brought food, not fresh food, nothing ever truly fresh, just enough to suggest love. Bread gone stale, wine turned, flowers already drooping. The gesture was enough. And sometimes it wasn't. And that was fine too, because in Rome, the dead were not clean. They were not sacred. They were just there, part of the architecture, part of the air. You passed them in the hallway. You named your son after them. You buried them beneath the floor. Sometimes right under the dining table. Imagine that. Feasting above your grandmother's ribcage, toasting life while sitting on death. But it made sense. In Rome, nothing was separate. Not food and rot. Not sex and sweat. Not grief and routine. The body broke. The city remained. And sometimes, when plague came, when the gods turned their faces and the streets filled with the sound of lungs breaking, they didn't debury them at all. The dead stacked like bricks, burned in fields without names, carried on carts pulled by oxen too tired to care. And still they lit incense. Still they prayed. Still they whispered the names. And who cleaned it all? The slaves, always. The same hands that washed the feet of generals now scrubbed blood from marble, not with soap, with salt, with piss, with whatever the empire had left behind. And when they grew sick from the stench, they were buried with no rites, just dropped. And still the city pulsed. And you, still awake, still breathing, still hiding behind your screen or your silence. You think you are different. You think you are cleaner. But tell me, when your pet dies, where do you bury it? When your grandmother passes, do you sleep in her bed the next week? When your loved one's shirt still smells like them, how long until you wash it? Or do you wash it at all? We are not better. We are just further from the rot. For now. They called them viae, the roads. But they were more than stone paths. They were the veins of empire, pulsing not with blood, but with sweat, sewage, sandals, and secrets. Rome didn't breathe from its temples. It wheezed from its streets. If you want to know the truth of any civilization, walk it. Barefoot, if you dare. Let your heels sink into what history forgets to mention. The scraps, the dung, the drip. Let your nose guide you, not to the marble columns, but to the warm crevices between market stalls, where something is always rotting, and someone is always pretending it isn't. The Roman street was not a clean slate. It was layered in filth, in noise, in memory. It reeked of ambition and spoiled figs. Human waste flowed alongside spilled wine and goat urine. There were no bins, no collection days, no men in uniforms sweeping it all into a future someone could believe in. There were trenches, yes, shallow drains that ran down the center, meant to carry the overflow. But they clogged, always, and when it rained, Rome didn't glisten. It gurgled. The water rose, thick and brown and unwilling. It brought everything to eye level. The piss, the prayers, the coin you dropped in the morning. It taught you to look down, always down, if you didn't want your sandal to betray you. And yet these streets, these unwashed rivers of empire, were not abandoned. They were alive. The markets shouted from dawn. Fish laid out on stone slabs, still twitching with their last muscle memory. Chickens in cages stacked so high, they could see their own future 2 rows down. Bread that flaked when touched. Cheese that sweated in the sun. Olives soaked in oil so old, it remembered better centuries. And beneath the goods, the rot. Peels, bones, feathers. Rats that no one bothered to chase anymore. Flies thick enough to be mistaken for a shadow. Children ran barefoot through it all, mouths sticky with dates, hands sticky with more. They laughed the way only the unbathed can, from the gut, from the filth, from the knowledge that the world does not care if your feet are clean when you die. Old men sat on crumbling steps, chewing things that weren't food, muttering things that weren't prayers. Their skin cracked like old maps, and their eyes followed the legs of women who didn't notice them anymore, or pretended not to. And somewhere, always, someone was vomiting. Not out of illness, out of ritual. Rome had taught its citizens to make space. For food, for pleasure, for spectacle. So they purged. Right there. Against a wall, in a corner. No one stopped. No one gasped. A slave might wipe it up with a rag and return to his errands. A child might jump over it and land in something worse. The smell folded into the rest. A note in the symphony. Graffiti covered the walls. Not poetic, not revolutionary. Just crude, honest, names carved beside genitals. Prices for sex. Drawings of men defecating, their expressions caught forever in the ecstasy of relief. The city itself participated in its filth. The brick spoke back. Rome was never mute. It moaned from its stone. And above all this, the noise. Not just human, animal, hooves on stone. Dogs barking. Donkeys braying as they pulled carts that sagged with amphorae of wine, some of them leaking trails that mixed with the piss streams. And always the crows, watching, waiting, as if they remembered something we forgot. The Romans wore sandals, but rarely cleaned them. The dirt became part of them, embedded, identifying. A senator's feet might be cleaner, but not by much. Status did not hover above the street. It walked in it, dragged through it. When it returned home, it left a trail. That trail dried and cracked and became dust again. Dust that children would touch, that lovers would kiss, that mothers would sweep and throw into the alley where it rejoined the cycle. Vendors didn't wash their hands. Why would they? The olives still sold. The meat still cooked. The coins still passed. They licked their fingers and adjusted your change. And you took it. Because Rome had taught you not to flinch from the transaction. You didn't know who last touched that coin, who bled on it, who spat on it. You only knew it bought bread, or flesh, or a vial of Spanish urine to polish your teeth. At night, the streets quieted, but they didn't sleep. Lovers crept. Thieves prowled. Cats hunted rats the size of dreams. The torches flickered against walls, stained with decades of indecision. A drunk collapsed where a priest had walked that morning. A prostitute leaned against the same column where a senator had orated last week. Rome blurred, again. Always. It didn't matter who you were in the dark, as long as you remembered who to become at dawn. And sometimes you'd find bodies, not dead, not always. Just tired, or beaten, or worse. A stain, a scent, a sigh. Public urinals? There were a few. But mostly, people pissed where they stood. Children, women, soldiers. If they needed, they did. Against a wall, into a pot, across a stair. Rome did not apologize for its functions. It celebrated them. In poems, in statues, even in taxes. Emperor Vespasian made money from urine. The collectors paid him to gather it. And when his son scoffed at the practice, he held up a coin and said, non-alert. It doesn't smell, but it did. Everything did. And still, they called it the greatest city in the world. Because it was. Not despite the filth, but because of it. Because it was real, raw, unhidden. Rome knew that beneath every perfume is sweat. Beneath every scroll is blood. Beneath every empire is the street, and the street is never clean. They built with marble, yes, but they built on dung. They wrote poetry, yes, but they wrote it beside gutters. They philosophized, debated, conquered, but they did it with shit under their sandals and the taste of yesterday, scarlet still clinging to their molars. And you, still clinging to the modern myth of hygiene, might feel superior. Your shoes are clean, your hands sanitized, your streets swept, but do you know what they hide? What they bury beneath the pavement? What they bleach until it forgets itself? Rome remembered. Rome let it rise. Rome wore it like a badge. And perhaps that's why she still lives, in the veins of every modern city, in every alley that stinks of history, in every drain that sings when it rains, in every coin that passes through 1,000 hands and still smells faintly of something unspoken. Because filth, when accepted, becomes foundation. And Rome built hers proudly. So now you've seen it. Or rather, you've smelled it. You've walked its cracked stones with bare feet and bitten its vinegar-slicked fruit. You've kissed the sponge. You've slept in the rot. You've sat where they squatted and eaten what they embalmed in oil and denial. You've shared their breath, their piss, their blood. You've swallowed Rome, not the marble one they sell you in textbooks and tourism campaigns, but the pulsing, fungal, groaning Rome that refuses to die because it was never truly born clean. The Rome that exhaled through sewers and whispered through latrines. The Rome that birthed itself not through law or literature, but through grime, and then wore that grime like silk. You came for history. What you got was a confession. And now, what do you do with it? You're still sitting there, aren't you? Eyes a little wider than when we began. Maybe your skin feels different. Not dirtier. Not quite. But more ... honest. As if the surface of you has remembered that it too is porous. That it too leaks. Maybe your jaw clenched a little when the sponge passed from hand to hand. Maybe you gagged when the garum spilled into the figs. Maybe you wanted to scream when we stepped into the brothel, the grave, the street. But you didn't. You stayed. Because somewhere, deep beneath the politeness you've worn like perfume, you already knew that there is no such thing as a clean civilization. Just well-lit corners and conveniently forgotten shadows. Rome didn't forget. That's why it's still here. That's why its bones still whisper through ours. Look around you. What do you think you've built that they didn't? Roads? Rome had them. Governments? Rome led them. Toilets, currency, contracts, concrete, surveillance, spectacle? Rome did it all, sometimes better, often dirtier. And in every public bath, every coliseum, every street vendor smiling behind chipped teeth, they left you a message. You are not new. You are not the peak of anything. You are just next. And what of your sponge? Don't pretend you don't have one. It may not be soaked in vinegar and shame, but it's there. Maybe it's the screen you press against your face for hours. The thing you touch after touching 1,000 other things. Maybe it's your feet scrolling, passing, absorbing, wiping your soul clean of boredom and thought. Maybe it's the lie you tell when someone asks if you're okay. The performance of hygiene, of grace, of civility. Rome had its sponge. You have yours. And neither was ever about cleanliness. They were about not looking. About doing what needs to be done without admitting what you are. Human, which means filthy, hungry, leaking, and sacred. That's the part that Rome never forgot. That the sacred does not exist in spite of the filth, but through it. That the divine is not sterile. It bleeds. It sweats. It eats. It decays. The gods walked among them not in temples, but in brothels and bathhouses, in the oily shimmer of a gladiator's back, in the damp smell of freshly used strigil. Jupiter himself, they believed, took lovers in animal form, not because he was base, but because he was true. The wolf suckled Rome's founders not in horror, but in myth. They never apologized for the animal in them. They crowned it. So why do you? Why do you flinch at your own scent, your own hunger, your own needs folded in the back corner of your throat? Why do you pretend that the parts of you that smell are lesser than the parts that shine? Who taught you that soap was morality, that bleach was virtue, that sterilization was next to godliness? Rome would laugh at you, softly, pitifully, because Rome knew what you still resist, that rot is not failure, it is process. Look at your cities, at your gutters after rain, at your sidewalks after festival. Look at your hospitals, your morgues, your kitchens after midnight. Look at your clothes after heartbreak, at your pillow after you screamed into it. Look at your skin, at your pores, at the way you touch yourself in the dark. Tell me, do you see anything clean? No, good. You're honest now. Rome was not a lesson. It was a mirror. And tonight you looked, not at its victories, not at its monuments, but into its latrines, its baths, its mouths. You looked where it most wants to be forgotten. And what you found wasn't shame. It was recognition. They were disgusting. And so are you. And it is beautiful. Because beauty, real beauty, has always been entangled with ruin. The flower that blooms out of compost, the kiss that tastes of sweat, the memory that smells of old sheets, the child born in a room where someone just died. That's life. That's civilization. That's Rome. And so the sponge passes on, not in stone, not in scripture, but in us, in the way we clean what will never be clean, in the way we wipe and deny, in the way we perfume decay and sell it as virtue, in the way we pretend our appetites are noble, in the way we whisper history like it's someone else's mess. But it's ours, and now you know it. So what will you do? Will you scrub harder? Or will you look? Will you pour more soap into your silence? Or will you sit in the stink long enough to understand it? Will you turn off this story and forget it? Or will you wake up tomorrow with Rome still under your fingernails? Because Rome doesn't end. It stains, and the sponge, it's in your hand now. So tell me, how will you pass it?